Namaste and welcome to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. We have been dwelling on the theme of continuing our consciousness across lives, drawing on Sri Aurobindo's description from the chapter 22 of the Life Divine, where Sri Aurobindo gives us the entire rationale of the nature of transition in what we call death, the processes, the machinery, so to say, the stages through which the soul journeys, why, how, and what is the utility, and in what way it prepares for the next incarnation. And the rationale of all this rooted in the one thing which is most important, which is the evolution of consciousness, the soul's evolution across lives. If you eliminate that, the entire thing becomes meaningless, pointless, exaggerated, superfluous. Bring that in, and every single thing which is described and the stages of life journey are seen to be so essential, but also so logical in the necessity of things. It is in this way that we realize the value of every little detail and the extraordinary intelligence with which this whole cosmos has been built for this one purpose, to fulfill the soul's evolution and its larger goal as a consequence of that evolution, which is the conscious manifestation of the divine in the world, and in this case particularly in the material world. So this is the background of what we have covered so far, and it has been a fascinating journey because Sri Aurobindo goes in so much detail. We are now at the last part of this chapter 22, where Sri Aurobindo has described what is required for us to maintain continuity of consciousness, of the mental consciousness, from one life to the next, the three requirements, and the same three requirements if we want to continue with the vital substance, with the vital individuality, with the vital body. So mental and vital bodies can be taken into the next with continuity of consciousness, with whatever detail is required to be retained. But remains the question of the physical. And it is this which is now our challenge. Can the physical body itself be extended? Because the question really was, the body somehow has to end. And so we want to retain the mental and vital in the soul's continuity. But can the physical itself not be extended? And why not? Or if it can be, would it contradict the larger purpose of continuity of the soul and its need to discard the layers and shells? Can these three requirements of the mind and vital be also applied to the physical body? And somehow the body itself extended with the same mechanism. Logically, that should be possible. There's one problem though. We notice that the substance of mind is inherently plastic, as also substance of the vital. The willpower, even the mental will, is enough to shape your outlook, shift your perspective, create new thoughts, or if you have ever had a lucid dream, just by willing it, create entire new worlds of anything you imagine, instantly. In the vital consciousness, the same thing reflected in a different way. Whatever you fear instantly tends to become. In other words, you project, you create what you fear. Substance is still somewhat plastic. As you go down towards the material worlds, everything becomes heavier, coarser, more rigid, more sticky, more resistant to change. Until as you touch the material world proper, you find rigidity. Matter is too rigid, and you may try all the will you want to put, you cannot reshape it. Interesting though, if you think about it deeply, Isn't that the very nature of permanence? In some way, matter is as if replicating permanence, but by rigidity of form. So within this, you find a glimpse of a secret. It's as if within the domain of matter, the attempt or the aspiration is not only perfection of form, but that it should somehow represent permanence, even in the form. And if that permanence is lacking, then we find that material to be too fickle. We build our greatest constructions of temples which represent our aspiration to the divine with the hardest, most lasting material, typically granite, isn't it? Why? Because we are as if trying to capture something of that eternity in matter. Our greatest works of art of any kind are those in which after a few centuries you still feel the touch of that which is behind, and it's still relevant. Indirectly, we are seeking that permanence, even in form, even in matter. And isn't the rigidity of matter itself, in some sense, a coarse way of trying to attempt to catch, to grasp permanence, except that it cannot? The nature of matter, the nature of the material world, Sri Aurobindo describes using the vocabulary of yoga, annam. Annam is as matter. Also, the same word means food. So, in the nature of the material world, the eater, while eating, is himself being eaten. And this is represented in the Western tradition with the snake that eats its own tail. If you think about what that would mean, not purely materially, because purely materially, eventually the snake will die. But take it a little bit off into a more symbolic domain. As it is eating its tail, it's feeding itself and becomes longer, and so there's a circular flow. In a sense, matter seems permanent. In fact, at the level of a subatomic particle is in continuous impermanence, instability. We are taught in physics that a single neutron, for example, inside the core of the atom converts itself into a proton and a neutron back and forth. Or an electron might jump across atoms and go across billions of atoms within a second and come back to this one or not. It's almost like a gas flowing across. What is permanent? Nothing. I believe in the quantum physics you are told the proton undergoes 14 steps of change before becoming proton once again. And continuously. All of them are unstable. And yet the combination atom seems to have an appearance of stability. And then that is what Sri Aurobindo describes as the first type of ego. Something rigid, holding on to its own, not allowing itself to be dissolved, and what a huge effort nature has put with a strong will to hold it together. And then combining these atoms to form more and more stable structures. So in the very underlying instability of the material world, building a stable formation which eventually comes back to our body itself, built of those atoms and molecules and then cells, all of them in transition at each level, having its own world of transitions and processes, still tends to retain a sufficient stability of form and then a growth within that, which eventually becomes sufficiently refined as to be able to embody life and then mind and then spirit, and embody the spiritual and the divine. What an achievement if you think about it. And it took a few billion years to get to that point at least, isn't it? But obviously implicit to this is the suggestion that it's not meant to be impermanent. It's meant to as if represent or embody even the eternity as well as the infinity of the divine consciousness. May not always be in rigidity of the form, sustained form transitioning could still retain the whole consciousness. And so we come back to those three things which Sri Aurobindo had referred to as the requirement for the mind, and we can reread that portion. The aspiration for the mind to survive could only succeed if the mind, life and body could put on something of the immortality and divinity of the indwelling spirit. So he has put mind, life and body together. There are certain circumstances in which the survival of the outer mental personality representative of the inner mental Purusha could be possible. It could happen if our mental being came to be so powerfully individualized on the surface and so much one with the inner mind and the inner mental Purusha, and at the same time so open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite, that the soul no longer needed to dissolve the old form of mind and create a new one in order to progress. Remember always here, it is the soul's influence which is, and the soul's choice, which is making the decision to dissolve the old form of mind in order to form a new. And here the soul says, I don't need to. Then I might as well carry it because there might be useful things. Or it may say this life there's too much clutter. I will discard a large part of it but keep something relevant. But I don't need to discard all anymore. So these three conditions. Could this apply to the physical? So first of all, you would need in the physical consciousness powerful individualization on the surface, as well as uniting with the inner physical and inner mental Purusha, inner physical Purusha, and at the same time so open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite that the soul doesn't need to discard the body. Now the first part, powerful individualization in the physical, is possible. We see some examples of that also. But large parts of humanity are not. You have to be clear about this. But we do see some good examples. We also see examples where there is sufficient connection to the inner physical. We don't see enough examples of the physical body being plastically open to the progressive action of the infinite. Because inherent to the nature of matter's attempt to become immortal, to persist, is rigidity, hardness. And we see this as the very underlying character of aging. The more you harden, the more you have aged. The more you are plastic, the more you remain young. So you can actually measure the hardness and the overall sense of decay. And that is your measure of, let's say, old age. So for a long time, for me personally, this was a question, because the mother had said that when she went into the cells of the body, she found they didn't need to die. It was by habit that they aged or decayed and died. By habit of a very early phase of evolution in which again and again life force tried to build itself and then was beaten down and collapsed. Again pushed and again collapsed and again pushed and collapsed, until the habit that it has to push, rise, and then eventually it has to exhaust itself, give up and collapse. That habit itself sustained. And she relates it to that phase, that early period of life forms emerging out of matter. And she found in the cells there was no compulsion to age, to decay or to die, other than this habit. For a long time I took this to mean that the extension of biological life would face enormous resistance because of this habit in the cells. And this was a bit of a shock when I discovered, and somewhat recently, a few years ago, the work of some recent biological research, particularly of one doctor from Harvard University, who was able to regress aging. And he found there were 4 factors which are connected to aging. If you regress using all 4, then the cell becomes cancerous. If you regress using 2 of them, these are called Yamanaka factors, based on a Japanese scientist by the name of Yamanaka. If you use 2 of the Yamanaka factors, then you can regress aging of the cells without them becoming cancerous. And not only that, he found he could regress to whatever age required. He could then accelerate aging to the cells and regress and accelerate and back and forth practically without limitation. And this was a bit of a shock because the assumption, wrong assumption on my part, was that the habit is limited to this habit of aging. What we discover though is that nature has other habits. And one of those habits is, it is logical, I should have thought of it, that all the time, every day, the cell ages, let's say a certain amount. And every day at night, the cell regresses aging by a certain amount, isn't it? So nature has built into the cellular machinery also this ability to regress aging. We don't have just the habit of aging, death, decay and death. We have also the habit of recovery using certain grooves of habit lines that nature has built up, again from that early period. And it's tied fascinatingly to the day-night cycle. During the day you have stress which accelerates aging, during the night you have the rest during which the regression takes place, to whatever extent. That extent is controlled by various other factors, influenced by various factors. For example, if you don't have proper sleep, then the regression is less. If you have had good sleep, a definition of good sleep is when regression was sufficient. But there are other factors we see, and one of these is stress. And what the scientist in Harvard University is Dr. David Sinclair. What he discovered was, and there are others who have done, so perhaps it's not just him, what they discovered was that when the cells are stressed, then they trigger the regression, age regression more quickly. What this means is, if there is a famine, if there is excessive breakdown of some kind, immediately the cells go back into accelerated regression rather than allowing themselves to be broken down. So you see two movements. There is the aging habit and then there is the age regression habit. Between the two, the aging habit tends to dominate the regression habit. Except when there's a crisis, at which point automatically the regression habit dominates the aging and you actually become younger more quickly. Interesting. I remember when we were very young and I had at the age of 12, one of the things, having read and heard, I got into this raw food thinking that's the best thing possible. It made logical sense based on what I had read. But at that time we were in touch with one Mahavir Jain, and he was very much into all kinds of naturopathy, and coming from the Jain tradition, he was heavily into fasting. And he would tell us these extraordinary stories of people who cured themselves of all kinds of things by going on a fast. And then he would say, 3 days fast, 10 days fast, 20 days fast, 40 days fast, and so cured cancer, you going into fasting. It didn't make logical sense. Why should starving the body get you to regress or cure, when in fact you need more nutrition when your body is sick? It didn't make sense to me, but open mind, you keep an open mind, perhaps there's more to it. But what is fascinating is this knowledge, very specific knowledge coming from the Ayurveda and the naturopathy tradition, and in the Jain tradition particularly, was confirmed by David Sinclair's and other people's work, that when the cells are stressed, when the body is enormously stressed, particularly with fasting, the regression habit kicks in much stronger than the aging habit and even reverses sometimes. The cells are able to throw out the senescent cells, the dead cells, and are able to cleanse themselves and make everything young once again. A literal transfiguration is possible. Of course, there are conditions. You can't just say, I'll fast and it happens. There are certain conditions. And these include psychological conditions as well as certain biological conditions. But we don't go into detail now. But the logic of this was confirmed because you are triggering a certain cellular habit by that excess of fast. By triggering that, yes, certain diseases can be healed, cured. I don't recommend doing that. Be very careful. It's not something everybody can do. The body itself needs to have the habit of being able to manage long fasts and all that. And there are conditions, like I said, even the water that you take or the juices which you might take need to have certain basic materials in their composition by which are essential materials for the body to be able to rebuild. So I don't go into that. The point though is the stress triggers that. And then I came across something even more fascinating, that recent research shows this is built into the cycle of the daily routine. Morning, let's say, you're exposed to the rising sun and you have the infrared rays which are stronger in the morning. These trigger rejuvenation in the cells. As the sun rises, the ultraviolet rays are stronger, which trigger the breakdown of the cells and the stressing of the cells. And in the evening, when the sun sets again, you are bathed in infrared much more than ultraviolet. And then if you have a fireside after the sun has set, that gives off large amounts of long range, wavelength infrared, which triggers cellular regeneration by triggering melatonin production in the cells and so on, which is what happens at night. So your optimum youth cycle would be morning exposure to sunrise, afternoon a little bit of exposure, just enough to stress your system, to ultraviolet at around midday, and then evening again setting sun, followed by a fireside chat where you soak in the warmth of the infrared, and then a good sleep, during which the melatonin triggers the regeneration of the cells. So there was a rationale to the whole thing which was synchronized with the natural rhythms of nature and so on. But my point was the discovery of built-in habit pathways even for cellular regeneration and the body's regeneration. And one can trigger these by various means. So the question comes, and Sri Aurobindo puts this in a footnote when he speaks of body's extension. So I'm going to read a little bit of this. I'm going to read the rest of the text. We'll come back to this point. Just hold this. So, what would happen is that the wall between the inner self and the outer man would have broken down, and the permanent mental and vital being from within, the mental and vital representative of the immortal psychic entity, would govern the life. So this breaking of the veil, so to say, and the bridging of the inner and outer is one of the conditions. But equivalent thing could happen in the physical also. Our mind nature and our life nature could then be a continuous progressive expression of the soul, and not a nexus of successive formations preserved only in their essence. So you could have this continuous progression, not series of lives with different forms each time. Our mental personality and life personality would then subsist without dissolution from birth to birth. See, a critical element will be the plasticity, so that it can be reshaped. This would be evidently an immense victory of soul and mind and life over the inconscience and limitations of material nature. But this victory of the upper part on the lower, which is the physical, is still, it's a great victory, but there's still something remaining. Of this now he speaks in the next paragraph. But such a survival could only persist in the subtle body. The being would still have to discard its physical form. Have to. This is the condition. Have to. You don't have a choice there. Have to discard its physical form. Pass to other worlds and in its return put on a new body. Have to. The awakened mental Purusha and vital Purusha, preserving the mind sheath and life sheath of the subtle body, which are usually discarded, would return with them into a new birth and keep a vivid and sustained sense of a permanent being of mind and life, constituted by the past and continuing into the present and future. So you will reincarnate and you will have this sense of continuity. You will even remember whatever you choose to keep. But the basis of physical existence, the material body, could not be preserved even by this change. The physical being could only endure if by some means its physical causes of decay and disruption could be overcome. And at the same time, it could be made so plastic and progressive in its structure and its functioning that it would answer to each change demanded of it by the progress of the inner person. It must be able to keep pace with the soul in its formation of self-expressive personality, its long unfolding of a secret spiritual divinity, and the slow transformation of the mental into the divine mental or spiritual existence. So body has to keep pace with all this. We'll review these lines in some detail now. First of all, he says, the physical being could only endure if by some means its physical cause of decay and disruption could be overcome. Now, here's a fundamental distinction between physical substance and mental and vital. In the physical substance, inherent is decay and breakdown. How do you overcome this? And this is physical substance as matter. Take stone, it wears off eventually. Maybe 1,000,000 years, but it will wear off. That's how you have your mountains and valleys and so on. And the body's cells, of course, are more complex. They're the wearing off, you could still replace, but there's a wearing off and you have to continuously overcome that. And as we have seen, there may be pathways for regression also of aging. Still, cause of decay disruption should be overcome, not entirely removed, overcome. And at the same time, it could be made plastic and progressive. So this plastic and progressive we will keep for later. Let's focus on this part alone. Here is a footnote. If cause of decay and disruption could be overcome, and Sri Aurobindo has a footnote where he says, even if science, physical science or occult science, were to discover the necessary conditions or means for an indefinite survival of the body, still, if the body could not adapt itself so as to become a fit instrument of expression for the inner growth, the soul would find some way to abandon it and pass on to a new incarnation. The material or physical causes of death are not its soul or its true cause. Its true inmost reason is the spiritual necessity for the evolution of a new being. The true inmost reason for the physical death is the spiritual necessity for evolution of a new being. So understand this, you cannot get around this part. If you have the necessity, spiritual necessity for evolution of a new being, biology has to keep up with the necessity of this new being, otherwise death becomes necessary, even if somehow you can extend the lifespan of the biology and age regress it indefinitely. Because then what would happen, he says, the soul would find some way to abandon it and pass on to a new incarnation. Some way, it could take many ways. One of these would be simply by using accidents, or it could simply say, this is enough, I am so fed up with this life, I want to leave. And just like that it would leave. By choice. One day to the next. With a healthy body, it says enough, now I shut down and withdraw. Ideally, of course, it would do it in a slow, gradual way, but still. The point is it can do it. So, this being the condition for which we need that flexibility, and we'll come back to that. Still, if the body could not adapt itself so as to become a fit instrument of expression for the inner growth. So, body needs to keep adapting to be a fit instrument for the inner growth. But the first portion of this footnote is fascinating. If science, so even if science were to discover the necessary conditions or means for an indefinite survival of the body, still if the body can't adapt. Okay? In the phrasing here, and Sri Aurobindo is very precise with his words, as we have seen. In the phrasing here, he is not saying, if something exists like this. He says, if science were to discover the necessary conditions or means for an indefinite survival of the body. Implicit is that such conditions exist. And this is a mind-blowing observation. Sri Aurobindo is not saying, hey, what if? It's not speculation. He's saying such conditions exist, and if we were able to discover it for an indefinite survival of the body. Except that with the science, capital S, it's not a casual science, it is a whole body of knowledge. With the science, he has a parenthetical comment, physical science or occult science. Now here we get two very interesting suggestions. What I was describing earlier of the work of Dr. David Sinclair is largely physical science. But equivalent such processes might exist on an occult level, because anything which physical science can do, occult science can do much more rapidly. Or anything which occult science can do, physical science can replicate with much more complexity and struggle perhaps. For example, what you have is telepathy, which is a direct contact of consciousness with consciousness to communicate thought, intention, influence, whatever. You are by physical science representing through various processes, including telephone, mobile phone, or even AI watching your brain waves to transmit, and so on. So much machinery to do something so simple directly to the consciousness. But still, there is an occult science process by which the body can be made to survive indefinitely, and there are people who do that. And then there's a physical science process, and perhaps there are combinations of both also. In the occult science process, and I'll just touch upon this, there are certain kinds of energies, and there's a particular grade of life force energy which has a rejuvenating effect on the biology. Those who have been able to tap into that can literally invoke that and infuse that into the body, and invoking it, you come out of whatever state of meditation, trance, sleep, you come out as if rejuvenated, you look even younger. I have not personally engaged with this in a way that I could give more details, but I've met people who had these experiences, and I trust them, describing exactly what it was, the quality and kind of energy, and it was clear that it had worked. Again, I don't know how long it lasts, to what extent, but this is simple, very simple direct process. But there would be then more indirect processes to tap into the same energy. Here the person said, well, I just happened to discover, oh, this is what this energy does, and that was it, by chance. But you would have then, or somebody could create an occult mechanical process by which you would invoke that energy, infuse, and so on, combining with certain elements of ritual or other means, indirectly. And this would be a more direct life force, vital energy process, combining necessarily with mind, because without the mind wanting and infusing this, directing it with an intention, it wouldn't work. So largely this would be the occult framework. The physical science process would be along the lines of the Yamanaka factors and triggering them by various means. So for example, in the latest videos that David Sinclair shared about his work, he came to a point where he creates a kind of a pill which combines 6 different substances which have all genetic influence on the biology, and taking that pill you find overall age regression to the biology. Let's assume they are going to charge very heavily, the knowledge will be kept secret, maybe at some point it will be rediscovered by others, and then we will find ways to make the technology cheap enough that many more people could start using this, and so on. Assuming that, and people start taking it. Let's say then we are able to extend our lifespan by a few more decades, or maybe more. I've also spoken about the Kayakalpa method described in Ayurveda, which follows similar mechanism, and I had shared some of my explorations on this on a theoretical level in another talk, so those of you who are interested can look at that. I won't go into it too much now. The point being, these are very simple scientific methods which observe that here are the triggers, biology has a built-in mechanism for age regression, and you can trigger it. Combine this, especially now from a yoga point of view, with the vital and mental alignment, because you could make the body younger and the vital and the mental are not aligned, and you would eventually hit a point of friction and contradiction. And these methods would become either less and less effective, or even if they maintain the biology's youthful appearance, you will find the person inside is so aged, so rigid, to be almost suffocatingly uncomfortable to manage. Which you see sometimes with people who have aged a lot. with the hardening of the biology, there is a hardening of the mind and the vital and tendencies and habits. Until they are almost anachronistic. They seem to live in a world which is 50 years ago, but have not been able to adapt to even the realities of their own growth. And you wonder, and it's painful to say it like this, but you wonder, what's the point? Unless you can recover the flexibility and plasticity, and this is what we will now focus upon. If we can, and the mind and vital choose to assert that flexibility and exercise it, then everything becomes meaningful. If not, just having the biology younger is not enough. So coming to this question of flexibility, David Sinclair was asked, with the aged brain cells, when you regress them and make them younger, do you get back the flexibility of the mind, its adaptability, its ability to learn? And his confirmation was yes, it is so. So it's possible potentially that we are even able to bring the biology up to a point of sufficient flexibility that you are as you were in your late 20s or 30s, even though your physical age might be whatever. But hang on, observe carefully. When you were in your 30s and you were flexible enough to learn new things, let's say, were you flexible enough still to learn everything? Or will you still largely bound and held in the framework of your temperament and biological and psychological temperament? So if you're an artist, you're stuck with the artistic side and you say, I can't handle numbers. If you're a technician, you say, I'm stuck with this, I can't handle abstract thought. Or if you're into abstract thought, you can't say, I can't handle whatever it is. Although within that domain you have flexibility. From the soul's point of view, that's not good enough. Remember the phrase Sri Aurobindo has used earlier, that it should be able to which is the line, so open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite that the soul no longer needed to dissolve the old form. Infinite. And we are here as soul as infinite potential. Remember again the line Sri Aurobindo uses here, that the physical being should be made so plastic and progressive in its structure and its functioning that it would answer to each change demanded of it by the progress of the inner person. So the moment your soul has progressed a little bit, let's say over the last few years you have progressed, and now your biology should be able to reflect that need. Is it plastic enough for that? And here we would face again the biological limitation of the heredity and of the genetics and the habit in the body. Within the narrow groove you would have plasticity of the youth, but not beyond that. Take an example, even when you are at your youngest, most plastic, let's say in the late teenage, just before or around the age of 21, which is considered to be sufficiently mature and yet plastic. How far could you go outside your domain of comfort in your plasticity? That problem would still remain. And so this is the real issue. That's why Sri Aurobindo puts it in a footnote, that even if science, physical science or occult science, were to discover the necessary conditions or means for an indefinite survival of the body, still if the body could not adapt itself so as to become a fit instrument of expression for the inner growth, the soul would find some way to abandon it and pass on to a new incarnation. And in the transition to a new incarnation, it would say, well, what is the kind of biology I can find suitable for the kind of experience I want to develop? And it will find that variety in some space and incarnate there. But with the continuity of the mind and vital, which have now been made sufficiently flexible, let's say. So the crux of the problem still lies with the biology itself needing to become superior in its ability to adapt. Is that even possible? We are hitting here limitations of biology which currently we are unable to overcome even with the technology of age regression. And at this point we have to ask ourselves, can we overcome this by psycho-spiritual means? Or maybe biological means, I don't know, but it seems no. But psychospiritual means yes, probably. And we're going to come to some very interesting observations of the mother on this issue. But I will just finish the text by reading a little more. It must be able to keep pace, so the physical body, with such extension of life even, and some flexibility. It must be able to keep pace with the soul in its formation of self-expressive personality, its long unfolding of a secret spiritual divinity, and the slow transformation of the mental into the divine mental or spiritual existence. Now consider that your mental is taking a long time to transform into this divine mental or spiritual existence. Let's take a phrase that the mother or Sri Aurobindo have used, 300 years. Somewhere mother speaks of Sri Aurobindo said 300 years. Let's take that as an indication. So over 300 years, your mind is going to become into the mold, shape into the mold of the divine mind or the spiritual existence. Is your biology able to adapt at the same pace while the slow transformation of the mind takes place in the long unfolding of a secret spiritual divinity? Can the physical keep pace? So we're going to come back to this question, but let's complete the text. This consummation of a triple immortality, mind, vital, physical, immortality of the nature completing the essential immortality of the spirit and the psychic survival of death, might be the crown of rebirth and a momentous indication of the conquest of the material inconscience and ignorance, even in the very foundation of the reign of matter. A very important statement. Literally, it's as if there is a conquest, there is a struggle of spirit with matter. Spirit has been, so to say, seizing upon matter and raising it to its higher potential. If we could achieve this triple immortality, nature completing the essential immortality of the spirit and the psychic survival of death, this now which is true for the psychic, being now expressed in nature in these three layers, might be the crown of a rebirth. So it's almost as if at that point you're saying that the whole purpose of rebirth was to bring us to that point where that mechanism is perhaps no more needed. And the momentous indication of the conquest of material inconscience and ignorance, even in the very foundation of the reign, the rule of matter. So it's been conquered, material inconscience and ignorance in the foundations of matter have been conquered by spirit. This is something very important to observe, foundations, because all this is going back to the biology basis and the physical basis of the tendency of matter for death, decay, rigidity, etc. If and when this is completed, not let's say if, when this is completed and this conquest is made, there will be a fundamental shift in the relationship of matter with spirit, and with it the release of the secret potential in matter. Remember what I pointed to earlier about matter itself as if somehow attempting permanence but by rigidity. If now it can open to that permanence in yielding to the divine will, divine law, divine influence, rather than inconscience, there's a reversal of some kind. Now it can reveal overtly the truth it was trying to realize by covert and even a false method. But still, Sri Aurobindo says, but the true immortality would still be the eternity of the spirit. The physical survival could only be relative, terminable at will, a temporary sign of the spirit's victory here over death and matter. Even in such an extreme case, the true immortality will be eternity of the spirit. Why? Because even though this has been achieved, let's say, in a body or in a series of bodies or even in an entire species of a planet, well, there is still matter overall everywhere else which is not yielding to and expressive of the spirit. Will that ever do? That's too long in the view of things. But for the moment it will be, he says, a relative victory, terminable at will, and a temporary sign of the Spirit's victory here in matter on earth over death and matter. So thus ends the chapter itself. And as far as our view and perspective is concerned, in the foreseeable future and even beyond, this is all that we need to be concerned about. But this thing about matter itself being able to yield and attain to a triple immortality has now a deeper potential. And this potential Sri Aurobindo refers to in greater detail in his articles, not in this synthesis of yoga which he wrote. Let's say this chapter might have been written around 1918 or 17, about. A year before he left his body, he took up a series of articles. Initially, he was asked by the mother to write something for the opening of the physical education program in the school. So he writes in the very first article, I am using this as an excuse to present much more. So he says what has to be said, and then he moves on to the whole description of the work to be done for this physical transformation. And the whole thing is published in a little booklet called The Supramental Manifestation upon Earth. These were articles which were published in the bulletin at that time, every month. And when Sri Aurobindo left his body, the last 3 articles had to do with what he called the mind of light, which was an intermediate poise in which something of the truth consciousness could actually inhabit our not yet perfected and divinized mind, so that we can have the first experience of a divine life on earth, with a mind that is free of ignorance, even though not yet supramentalized. And this he worked in himself, built this, it was not speculative. Everything he wrote was achieved by him in his own consciousness. And when he left his body, he infused all this into the mother, and through the mother, the potential was infused into humanity. So this is what we're going to discuss next, is extremely important. I will not be going into that text at all. That's a whole different topic which we will put online. I've done a whole series of lectures on that text which we will put online shortly. But I want to share a few observations which come from Sri Aurobindo's and the mother's writings regarding this potential of matter and why the body and the physical matter's transformation is so important and what is its potential. Sri Aurobindo writes in one of the letters I will have to jump a little bit. So he's speaking in one of the letters about, in response to certain questions, he's describing the various levels of consciousness. And then he says, it must be remembered that while this classification is indispensable for psychological self-knowledge, mental, vital, physical and various intermediate levels, and discipline and practice, self-knowledge, discipline and practice, it can be used best when it is not made too rigid and cutting a formula. And this is something we have often referred to, everything merges into everything else. For things run very much into each other, and a synthetical sense of these powers is as necessary as the analysis. So you analyze, oh, this is this, but you also synthesize, you see, oh, this blends into this. Mind, for instance, is everywhere. So you say mind in the brain, mind outside the brain, mind standing beyond physical body, in a body in of itself. Yes, all that is true, but it also infuses into brain, it also infuses into body, and it forms a mind of body or a mental awareness in body, and then a mind of body which is different, and then a mind in the cells, and then a mind even further down. Everywhere mind is there. But in the blending, it is as if reduced and has distinctive characteristics and strata of working. So the physical mind is technically placed below the vital. So this is mind embedded in the physical body. So it's below the vital. And yet it is a prolongation of the mind proper, and one that can act in its own sphere by direct touch with the higher mental intelligence. So here's the interesting part. Physical, vital, mental. Okay, let's map it like this as we do for little children, layering them. In reality, in the experience, the mind flows into all these. So the part of the mind that plugs into the biology is below the vital. And yet it's the same mind, so there's a connection. So something of the mind which is free of the vital and free of the biology can actually influence the mind in the biology, which is lesser than the vital, and can modify things there. By direct touch with the higher mental intelligence, you can act in the biology consciousness of the mind embedded in the biology. And there is too an obscure mind of the body, of the very cells, molecules, corpuscles. So this was, remember, physical mind. Below that, mind of the body. And that's literally what you experience in the instinct in the body itself, which you see in animals. When they are sick, they will chew on a plant and get healed. How do they know? And it's a bitter plant, they don't like it, and yet at that moment they crave it and do it. How do you know? Well, there is an intelligence there. This is also the same intelligence which repairs the body tissue, which brings back things into balance when you are sick, etc., which handles intelligently the operations such as digestion, absorption, etc., which in the heart, for example, automatically and constantly balances the amount of pumping required to adapt to other needs for other parts and systems of the body. There is a mind that holds it all together. And this we may call the obscure mind of the body. You go further down in the cells, there is the mind of the cells. You're not conscious of the cells. And yet this mind of the cells, of which you're not conscious, is an extension of the same mind in the body, and the mind which is beyond the body and beyond the vital in the higher free strata of intelligence. There's a continuum from there. So if in that mind you hold a strong persistent will, intention, visual, etc., persistent long enough, eventually it will seep into all these layers of mind, and even at the level of the mind of cells, intervene in cellular processes in ways that you could not imagine. But what will seep into that is not necessarily your surface mind intention, but a more underlying implicit mind intention. I'll explain how that works. And I've seen this in cases of people falling sick. I want to get well. And at the back, oh my God, if I get well, I have to take on all these responsibilities. I can't just sit back and relax the way I am. I'm so happy being relaxed and having everyone look after me. So on the surface, the patient will cry and say, oh, I really want to get well. And at the back, in some deeper layer of which they are not fully conscious or do not want to be conscious even, there's a part that says, this is so comfortable. I fear the responsibilities that will come if I actually get well. And suddenly all these people looking after me will stop bothering with me. They'll go back to their lives. I'll have to look after myself. I'll be all alone. And this becomes the thing which clings to wanting to stay in this state. If you observe carefully the working in the mind, you will notice that this part on the surface which says, I want to get well and I'm crying, how dare you say that I don't want to get well, is tiny compared to this part, which is much more deep, wide, and fixed in what it has chosen. So what will seep into the cells? This, not that on the surface. That on the surface is too small. Even if it were to turn inside and face this self-deception of the inside, it might find itself too overwhelmed. It does not want to. It fears to face it. And it will have an instinct to avoid facing its own self-deception. Therein lies the core, the crux of the illness. And that mind inner is working on the cellular functioning to maintain whatever illness is happening, even provoking it, or other illness, depending on which level it is in the mind of the body or mind of the cells. But then he continues, that's not all. There is also the mind which is in the molecules, and then in the corpuscles. He doesn't use the word atoms, interestingly. Interesting. There's a whole thing around it. You see, atoms is the term taken from the Greek tradition, which speculated that everything is reduced to tiny dots. And then we find that those dots are actually made of smaller dots, so they are not technically atoms. So they had to invent a new word, elements. And the elements are subatomic particles and so on. Sri Aurobindo doesn't get into that game. He just said corpuscles, tiny fragments of matter, which are, so to say, more rooted fragments. from which molecules are built, let's say. So in the molecules, there is a mind plugging in, and in the corpuscle, there is a mind. How is this seen? Well, in the most dramatic way that it is seen when people take a piece of metal and bend it. And there are demonstrations, some of them you will find on the internet, real ones, where people bend metal. Some of them are fake, we don't look at that. There are real ones. And we know of people, in this case I have met people who have been able to do it, but also you put the metal inside a box, plastic, sealed, and they'll still bend it. What happens at that point if you ask them? Their mind, so to say, leans into the material, and sometimes with the finger they need to touch to make that contact of consciousness. Here they are not conscious of what they are doing, but the part of the mind that embeds into the mind in the molecules, in that moment softens the molecules. And poof, that's all that happens. Softens the link between molecules. The molecules are held together by forces, we say forces of physics, but they're finally forces of consciousness, mind included. You enter into the thing which is gripping and relax it, and poof, the whole thing becomes soft. It's as simple as that. Or you went further down into the corpuscles. And I've mentioned this example of Ganapati Muni. He would hold a coin in his hand while he was narrating a story. When he would give it back, it had been transmuted into gold. Yes, these things also happen. So this is, we coming back to the text of Sri Aurobindo, and there is too an obscure mind of the body, of the very cells, molecules, corpuscles. Haeckel, the German materialist, spoke somewhere of the will in the atom. And recent science dealing with the incalculable individual variation in the activity of the electrons comes near to perceiving that this is not a figure, but the shadow thrown by a secret reality. So there's an underlying secret reality of which even this idea of will in the atom, yes, it's true. This body-mind is a very tangible truth. Owing to its obscurity and mechanical clinging to past movements and facile oblivion and rejection of the new, we find in it one of the chief obstacles to permeation by the supermind force and the transformation of the functioning of the body. So this body-mind, what is its problem? First of all, it's a very tangible truth. You can experience it, and it quite easily. You need to concentrate, really learn to separate out layers in awareness, but once you get to that, it's not difficult. You can identify and isolate it. But what do you find there? Obscurity. It is darkness, it is not conscious. Mechanical clinging to past movements. What has happened is all that it holds on to, and it's sticky. You try to push it, it resists. And its obscurity, and facile oblivion loses itself. You bring, as you join with it momentarily or conscious, you can raise an intention. The moment you let go, shoop, it forgets and drops back into as if sleep. Forgets itself. It's forgetful of any new impulse that is infused, it forgets and drops back. It's as if you made a New Year resolution, oh, I'm going to do this, and the next moment as you turn away, you forget what you decided to do. What resolution? I don't know. It drops back. So facile oblivion and rejection of the new. When something is imposed which is new, it actively pushes back. So this, he says, we find in it one of the chief obstacles to permeation of supermind force and the transformation of the functioning of the body. So permeation of supermind force, it has to infuse itself into the body. When it tries to infuse, this is the chief obstacle, and it is also what prevents the transformation of the functioning of the body. We're not speaking of transformation of the body. We're speaking of the functioning which has to be transformed. So remember, before body is transformed, its functioning will change. So it will become, for example, more and more able to repair itself, adapt to become flexible, shape itself to what is required, etc. So in the functions, a greater plasticity, freedom, conscious awareness, so that your choice to will yourself to be healthy should be enough to bring you back into health, etc. So even the functioning cannot be transformed because of this. On the other hand, he says, once effectively converted, it will be one of the most precious instruments for the stabilization of the supramental light and force in material nature. So this body-mind, when converted and effectively converted, it will become one of the most precious instruments for the stabilization. So the supramental force comes in, but cannot stay. But in this layer, if it can stay, and this layer once converted, here it will find a stable base. And from here it can act in the material nature, in the biology itself. And the supramental light and force can stay stably in this layer. Now this is work Sri Aurobindo has done. That's why he's able to say this with affirmation, based on experience. This work having been done in his body, he then infuses it into the mother. So this is one of many things. Well, let's look at now what the mother had to say about this very thing, this very sentence. So this is from the mother. So what I read earlier was from Letters on Yoga, and page 339, volume 22 of the centenary edition. I'm coming now to a different text of the mother in the agenda dated June 3rd, 1963, where she reads this text. And after reading it, she says, it corresponds exactly to my own experience. It is this mind of the cells which seizes upon a mantra or a japa and eventually repeats it automatically. And with what persistence? That is to say, continually. That's what Sri Aurobindo means when he says it can be a help. It keeps at things indefinitely. You see, the very thing which was resistant to the new, when it is effectively awakened, it is now clinging to the higher truth. And it is here that you find Sri Aurobindo's deep insight that how everything in the lower strata of consciousness, even though currently an issue, a problem, a resistance, when converted, the very same thing which was a problem before now becomes its strength. And then mother says, a few days ago, at the end of an activity or a situation which demanded an effort, almost a struggle, I heard the cells repeating my mantra. It was like a choir in which each cell was repeating the mantra automatically. Well, this is odd, I thought. And it was just after that, the next day, that someone showed me this letter. It is astonishingly true. I heard the cells repeating the mantra automatically in the difficulty. There was a difficulty. They were repeating the mantra like a choir. An immense choir in a church. It was very odd. As if there were lots of little voices, innumerable little voices, repeating and repeating the same sound. It gave me the impression of a church choir, but with lots and lots and lots of choir boys, tiny little voices. Yet the sound was very clear. I was dumbfounded. Very clear. The sound of the mantra. Here you get a glimpse of what it is to be engaged with the cellular consciousness. Remember, Sri Aurobindo is speaking of body-mind. Mother is now speaking of cellular mind. Considering that there is a continuity from there, she has gone to that level where now the cells are actually responding in this way. That's the work that she was doing in her body. So a lot of people speak of, okay, how do we get into the cellular consciousness? What can we do for the cellular yoga? Hang on, that comes later. Get first into body-mind. Before that, you have to get into body consciousness. Mind in the body, not body-mind. Mind in the body is what you're feeling when you become conscious of your body. Build that first. Build that to intensify that until your body becomes intensely conscious, at least in certain parts and functions. And then into that you infuse the intuitive content. This would pave the way for entering body-mind. And when that is sufficiently lit up, would pave the way for entering the cellular consciousness. Don't make the mistake, which I find a lot of people in the new age who tap into Sri Aurobindo without this deeper understanding of things, they start saying, oh, we work on the physical transformation or cellular mind, cellular consciousness. No, it's not like that. You have to go through these layers before you can consciously work on it. Of course, unconsciously, you can still work on it. By placing an intention simply. Become conscious of your hands, place an intention that may the cells of my hand receive become more conscious or receive the spiritual light or aspire. Place an intention, feel it. Yes, something will happen. But what will happen will seep through from your mind infused in the body, through the body mind, and then eventually into the cellular mind as a nudge at best. But if you have read what Sri Aurobindo said about the resistance of body mind, you know how much pushback there will be. And while every little drop counts, it's nowhere near actively working in those layers, for which you must become conscious in those layers. But still, it's a start. If that helps you, why? Put that intention, that let this intention go all the way down to the cells. It will make a difference. But then meanwhile, you have to consciously work to as if go down the layers to make them conscious and awaken in them the awareness of the Divine Presence and its influence as an active force. So I'm going to skip this part and go back now to another text of the Mother, which is something also very fascinating because she's speaking here of the body's potential. This is from one of the conversations she has dated 21st April 1954 in the Collected Works Volume 6 from the Mother's Entretien, the Conversations. And I read here. And this is very specifically regarding the body's potential as an instrument. This is one of the things one discovers gradually as the body becomes ready for transformation. So we are not talking of transforming the body, we are talking of making it ready for transformation, which is a big deal in itself. For which all the exercises you can do to make the body conscious, lift its awareness, etc., make it more supple, make it more conscious, all those things are going to be the preparation. So, it is quite a remarkable instrument in the sense that it can experience two contraries at the same time. There is a certain state of body consciousness which brings things together, totalizes things that in other states of consciousness alternate, or even in certain others oppose each other. In the mind, in the vital, certain things which oppose or alternate. You can't be happy and sad at the same time, you kind of switch between happy and sad. But if one has reached up there in the vital and the mind, a development sufficient for harmonizing opposites, and of course, that of course is quite indispensable. When one has succeeded in doing this, there are moments when it alternates. You see, one thing comes after the other. While what is remarkable in the consciousness of the body is that it can feel, experience. The word aware expresses it best. All things simultaneously, as though you were hot and cold at once, as though you were active and passive at once, and everything becomes like that. Remember, this is body consciousness, not body mind, okay, which is lower down. Then you begin to grasp the totality of movements in the cells. It is something much more concrete naturally, but much more perfect in the body than in any other part of the being. This means that if things continue in this way, it will be proved that the physical, material instrument is the most perfect of all. That is why perhaps it is the most difficult to transform, to perfect. But of all, it is the one most capable of perfection. It's very interesting what she's saying here. That is why it will be proved. If things continue in this way. So what she's showing is that in the body there's a capacity to hold multiple states or multiple experiences at the same time, which in other parts of the consciousness are not possible. You see, even in your mind or in the emotions, if you're happy and sad at the same time, they're in different parts. A part of me is happy and a part of me is sad. Different parts. You can't be happy and sad in the same part at the same time. Or in the mind, you have contradictory positions, you can either place them in different parts of your mind, or you can heal them in a larger context where under these circumstances that is true, under those circumstances the other is true, and so we have a synthesis of a kind. But to experience truth, this is true and false at the same time, in the same part, in the same state of circumstance, not possible. Not possible in the mind, not possible in the vital, but possible in the physical consciousness. And this is something quite extraordinary. Much more perfect in the body than in any other part of the being. This means that if things continue in this way, so she is showing you a potential of the body, and if this potential is now fully developed, it will be proved that the physical, material instrument is the most perfect of all. It can hold multiple states, multiple truths, multiple experiences at the same time in the same substance. Now this is not so irrational, and one would even say this might be a logical potentiality of the body. Why? Because matter itself, remember, is as if the condensation of all the levels of consciousness, of all the planes, bound into form. In this body tissue, we experience life force and mind at the same time in the substance of body itself. So it's the very nature of the body, as if material substance, to embody all the gradations of consciousness in the same moment, in the same substance, which means it has this potential somewhere. And the way the mother is articulating it, she points as if this is what it's meant to become eventually. Fascinating. There's one more text of the mother where she mentions something similar. I'll see if I can find it. This is in Sri Aurobindo's description of the physical consciousness. Okay, so this is from those articles where I spoke of. Sri Aurobindo wrote in the last few months before he left his body, where he speaks of this mind of light. But before that, there's a chapter. One of the articles is titled "The Divine Body." And so there he speaks of what that would be and the gradations of stages which lead up to that. And he actually speaks of how eventually, even for the body to acquire the full plasticity, to be reflective and expressive of the soul's need, retaining still its materiality, the same density, the basic functioning would have to undergo a change. So how, for example, in the biology that we have, the bone offers the rigidity, the muscle offers the movement capacity, and the rest is, the skin is like a bag and the fascia is like a bag holding it all together. Because they are contradictory in their functions, bone and muscle. But if the material itself becomes now transformed and is able to then take on multiple functions, it can become rigid or soft as it wants in its substantiality. Then the specific utility of the bone as a rigid part would fade, for example. The specific way that an organ functions, and Sri Aurobindo explains, the mother describes this, the heart needs to pump what? It needs to pump life force everywhere to the rest of you, through oxygen, through blood, etc. Those are indirect means. If the heart's functioning is to be replaced by a direct functioning of life force being spread out, how would that be? It's a bit beyond our conception, and Sri Aurobindo tells you it's a long way away, but this is the direction that it has to go to. So I will read a little bit from that. When he says the body worked out by these molecules, atoms, molecules and cells, these still are agents for forces which work through them. So if that were the truth, it is obvious that any divinization or divine transformation of the body or of anything else would be, he's still speaking of, if everything is just material, then of course transformation is impossible. But so even if you say that the soul has to work through the biology machinery, then you have a block. And he discusses all the consequences of that. This could not be called a truly divine body. For in a divine body, an inherent freedom from all these things would be natural and perpetual. This freedom would be a normal and native truth of its being, and therefore inevitable and unalterable. A radical transformation of the functioning and it may well be of the structure, and certainly of the two mechanical and material impulse and driving force of the bodily system would be imperative. How is that possible? How could this be done? What agency will be found for this change? And he speaks of this occult potential that exists in us through the knowledge of the chakras. What are the chakras doing? He says behind the biological process is the life force working through the chakras, or other higher forces working through the chakras, operating in and through them. So these centers being half closed or fully closed, the access of that working is indirect, secondary. But if these were to come forward and they acted directly more and more, so what would be the result of the emergence of these forces and their liberated and diviner action on the body itself? What their dynamic connection with it and their transforming operation on the still existing animal nature and its animal impulse and gross material procedure? It might be held that the first necessary change would be the liberation of the mind, the life force, the subtle physical agencies, and the physical consciousness into a freer and diviner activity, a many-dimensioned and unlimited operation of their consciousness, a large outbreak of higher powers, and the sublimation of the body consciousness itself, of its instrumentation, capacity, capability, for the manifestation of the soul in the world of matter. So here we are looking at something much farther about the body's potential for plasticity. All these powers through which the soul acts, if they are fully released in the working of the body, they take charge and they operate more and more directly. They will even tend to bypass the limitations of the biological working. Now we see this very easily in certain basic capacities when, for example, through some breathing exercises, you are able to activate heat in the body, which is far more than the calories the body can produce. Standard technique, which we have mentioned before, which is taught to some of the ascetics, monks who live in the Himalayas. In the Tibetan tradition, it's called the Tsumo fire. You activate the life energy in a particular way to heat the body. You sit naked on the frozen lake, you dig a hole there and dip a blanket in freezing water, wrap it around you and dry it with body heat. On and on and on through the whole night, one after another, drying blankets. Your body is producing far more caloric heat than is possible in the biology alone. You don't lose weight at the end of it. Where are you drawing the heat from? Well, from the direct action of the life force working through biological process to develop heat. And if an equivalent thing can be done to all the forces working and their relation to the biology, then you see this happening. With it, stabilization, purification of the processes, because now operated by higher powers, less of the animal dependence. And still he says there will be some material residue remaining, because finally you are resting on the biology process. So he speaks of further possibilities where even this could be replaced, and the material process itself and the material substance itself replaced by a densification of this operation. So we see, for example, in Hatha Yogi is the ability to stop the heart's working and still mind and body continue functioning normally. No heartbeat. How does it happen? Where they are able to draw life force and circulate it directly using what is called the Vyana Vayu, which spreads all over. And it spreads life force. The way the heart spreads oxygen, it spreads life force. If you can tap into this, you can slow down the heart rate or even stop it entirely and still remain conscious, alive, and the cells work normally, as if they're getting the equivalent of what oxygen would bring to them. It's not oxygen, it is the thing which oxygen carries, which is life force. So he shows logically that such a thing could happen fundamentally, and it could lead to a fundamental shift even in the organic structure of the body. And all this is still far, remember. We are not looking at this as an immediate requirement. And the centers of the subtle body itself would then fuse into the physical and so on. I am skipping large portions where he describes all this as a method. but yet there has to be a continuation of the form. It's not as if the biology would be replaced by a totally different subtle substance. You still want materiality, for example. So he deals with that question. The body itself might acquire new means and ranges of communication with other bodies, new processes of acquiring knowledge, a new aesthesis, new potencies of manipulation of itself and objects once this change happens. And so much more means of annulling distances, bringing the far to the near, and so on. All these, which currently are powers of the subtle body, would now be natural to the biology body itself. So for this, one of the first requirements, the mother says, is a huge suppleness which needs to be brought into the body. And unless the body is made supple enough, even this kind of change, we cannot even conceive of such a change, and that would be like a first step. So here we have an interesting text of the mother where she speaks of this, and I'm going to read a little bit of that. She says 4 requirements. Let me find the text. So there are 4 requirements which she has described. I had yes. So the mother speaks of first, before the supramentalization of the consciousness of the body can take place, there has to be what she calls an improved body. So this is a very interesting idea. I have always said that there were 2 points on which the future hadn't been revealed to me. First, what the first form of supramental life on earth would be exactly. That is to say, the stage that will follow man as he is. Then, the other point, which was more personal, could the transformation of this body, being mother's body, go far enough to allow an indefinite prolongation? Or would the work of the cells be somehow partly wasted? She has worked on her body's cells to make them immortal and succeeded. I can't say I have answers. But in both directions there has been opening, as it were. The transition between the two appears really possible only through the entry, the conscious and willed entry, of the supramentalized consciousness into a body that we could call an improved physical body. In other words, the human physical body as it is now, but improved. The improved produced, for instance, by true physical training, not in its present exaggerated form, but in its true sense. It is something I've seen fairly clearly. In an evolution, physical training is developing very fast nowadays. It's not even half a century since it started. In evolution, that physical training will bring an improvement, that is, a suppleness, a balance, an endurance, and a harmony. These are the 4 qualities: suppleness, plasticity, balance between the various parts of the being, endurance, and harmony of the body, that will make it a more supple instrument for the supramentalized consciousness. It's a very precise wording. Not supramentalization, supramentalized consciousness of mind. So mind has received an influence of the supramental. It's not yet supramentalized. For that you need a body already, suppleness, plasticity, balance between various parts, endurance and harmony of the body. And this would be what she calls an improved physical body. By physical training. And then she says something fascinating. She says, physical training is developing very fast. It's not even half a century since it started. Fascinating. 1965 she's saying this. Why half a century? In fact, it was part of the work of this push that the avatar gives for the change in the body. to suddenly bring into awareness the need for this in the mass of humanity. Today you can see how powerfully it has affected everybody. All of us without exception, in some way or other, are under pressure to do physical training of some kind. Many of you perhaps are doing it. But take this hint. You need to do it. For these 4 objects, build these 4 qualities: suppleness, plasticity, balance between various parts of the being, endurance, and harmony of the body. That will make it a more supple instrument for the supramentalized consciousness. While you're working, let's even replace the word supramentalized by intuitivized, okay, as a first step. And then for that, you'll have a suppler body as a vehicle. So the transition, a conscious and willed utilization by supramentalized consciousness of a body prepared in that way. The body must be brought to the peak of its development and the utilization of the cells in order to be, yes, consciously impregnated by the supreme forces, which is being done here in the mother at the moment. And this to the utmost of its capacities. And if the consciousness that inhabits that body, that animates that body, has the required qualities in sufficient amount, it should normally be able to utilize that body to the utmost of its capacity of transformation, with the result that the waste caused by the death of decomposing cells should be reduced to a minimum. To what extent? That's precisely what is still belongs to the unknown. That would correspond to what Sri Aurobindo called the prolongation of life at will for an indefinite length of time. So it's what we were reading in the text from the Life Divine, and she's linking it to that. Prolongation of life at will for an indefinite length of time, but on this level even in the body. But as things are at present, it would seem there is a transitional period in which the consciousness has to switch from this body to another, better prepared body. Better prepared outwardly, physically, not inwardly. Outwardly, I mean having acquired certain aptitudes through the present development, which this body doesn't have, of the 4 qualities, which it doesn't have in sufficient amount and completeness. That is to say, these 4 qualities must be in perfect accord and in sufficient amount to be able to bear the work of transformation. And then it goes into a fascinating discussion, which I will read because it completes a potential, a possibility in the direction of what we're discussing. Satprem asks, but are you talking about switching to a new body? Mother, in that case, one would have to switch to a new body. But a switching from the occult point of view, that's a known thing. A switching not to a body to be born, but to an already formed body. It would take place through a sort of identification of the psychic personality of the body to be changed with the other receiving body. But that, the fusion of psychic personalities, it's possible. I know the procedure, Mother laughs. But it requires the abolition of the ego. Yes, the abolition of the ego is certainly necessary. But if the abolition of the ego is sufficient in the supramentalized individuality, can I use the word individuality? In the supramentalized being, if the abolition of the ego is done, completed, that being has the power to completely neutralize the presence of the ego in the other being. And then, through that neutralization, the shrinking that always comes from a reincarnation would be cancelled. That's the dreadful thing, you see, the time lost in the shrinking into a new being. While through the conscious passage, willed and conscious, from one body to the other, the being whose ego no longer exists has an almost total power to abolish the other ego. All that occult mechanism needs to be developed. But for the consciousness, it's almost rational. That would be the procedure. The conditions for the almost indefinite prolongation of life of the body are known or almost known. They are learned through the work that must be done to counteract the extreme fragility of the physical balance of the body undergoing the transformation. It's a study every minute, as it were, almost every second. This is the extremely difficult part. It is difficult because of all the reasons I have already explained. Because of the intrusion of forces that are in a state of imbalance and have to be, as they come along, brought back to the new state of balance. That's where you find the sign of the unknown. So Mother is speaking of the work of her own body, and one of the things which she did in this mechanism which she has just described was she formed a new subtle physical body which was able to embody the supramental consciousness, and she was fusing that into her gross physical body. Remember what we discussed earlier, the outer and the inner have to be bridged. So the outer physical and the inner subtle physical, the true physical, and the physical Purusha has to be fused into this. Well, she built that body with a supramental basis and was fusing it into the physical. And this was the most extraordinary work that she was doing. And there are certain descriptions of hers in the agenda where she's speaking of this and in the last stage of the work. What this means again shows you, and there are descriptions of her, she describes how there is a friction of the two merging and the work she's doing. But at some point beyond the stage, she said she did not receive the sanction of the Supreme. It's almost as if the work was premature and that it is as far as she was permitted to take it, and then she made a choice then to leave. When she left the body, she transferred herself into that subtle physical body, which is now her vehicle, supramentalized subtle physical. That brought the supramental transformation all the way to the subtle physical. It's this last part of fusion into the physical which was remaining. And that's the work which she was doing at this point when she describes this. So here we complete our theme of the body itself, looking at its potential, but also looking at the logical conclusion of the text that we had been reading of Sri Aurobindo, where he says that this should be possible, that this consummation of a triple immortality, immortality of the nature completing the essential immortality of the spirit and the psychic survival of death, might be the crown of rebirth and a momentous indication of the conquest of material inconscience and ignorance, even in the very foundation of the reign of matter, conquest by the spiritual. And in this case, he has not spoken of the supramental in the text we have just read, but in other places where he speaks of the supramental. Now that is the power which can complete this process and bring the physical body itself into its diviner potential in substantial transformation, which is different from functional transformation, and many stages in between. So I think with this we have completed our study of conscious continuity of life, continuity of consciousness across lives. Naturally, this is the big picture, of which the only thing relevant for us right now, and I'm taking it to the bare minimum, if you can maintain this overall sense of aspiration and the work done in your consciousness of the life purpose and what you have built up in this life into the next, with whatever content of mental and vital that you can carry that is of relevance for this, that's enough. Because into the next body, you will still know why you're here, what you're here for, and the overall sense of the work done would be present for you to continue from, rather than losing, forgetting all over again and starting afresh from trying to find your life's purpose and direction and rebuilding everything from scratch. Even to that extent, based on what we have discussed, it should be obvious that the elements of your subtle physical that you have absorbed and sufficiently awakened in consciousness would also or could also be carried over sufficiently that they would be infused into the next. Think about that. And all this is within our reach. We're not yet speaking of supramental transformation. We're not speaking even of a transformation of any kind. Just building this continuity. For which, remember the three things which are required. If our mental being came to be so powerfully individualized on the surface, and so much one with the inner mind and the inner mental Purusha, and at the same time so open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite, that the soul no longer needed to dissolve the old form of mind and create a new one in order to progress. And the same principle replicated in the vital and to some extent in the subtle physical, let's say. work on this. For all of us, those of you who are still very young, you have more time, let's say. Those like me who are already crossed the halfway point, we have less time. And for others, well, you have been working at it already, so you are halfway there, perhaps at least in certain parts of this work, but work on it. And if nothing else, if you make this a certain focal point of your aspiration to build and work on this, then already a certain one-pointedness would have been built, that when you have to leave your body, you will be able to catch this stream of consciousness built up to make the bridge. Independent of that, based on what we have read today, work on your biology. Work on your body consciousness to build this, what Mother has called the improved body. And this improved body is absolutely essential for us to work upon while we're still in this body, improved physical body, containing or amplifying these four qualities: suppleness, plasticity, balance between the various parts of the being. Try to understand what that means, we won't elaborate. Endurance, again in various aspects, not just endurance in jogging, but in many other things. And balance, and harmony of the body. Harmony, starting with consciousness aligned, and then as a result of it in functioning and then in expression. Dwell on these four, work upon them through various means, use asanas, use exercises, use the gym facilities, or just infusing an intention as you walk, as you sit, as you work. Many ways you could start, whatever means you use. Be conscious of these four qualities that need to be amplified and pushed to their full. Remember, the body doesn't have in sufficient amount and in sufficient completeness. So build the sufficient amount and build the sufficient completeness. And remember, in the 7 or 6 limbs of the integral yoga, one of them is dedicated to the body itself, the Sharira Chatushtaya, the quartet of the body. And what does that mean? Remember, review that, working on the body consciousness, preparing it by making it more conscious to the influence of the intuition and eventually the supramental. I will conclude with a question, which was, there were several questions I had intended to take, we'll keep them for next time. But one question from Utpal, which said, do the Vedic texts mention any evidence of rishis' bodies transforming due to the supramental power they experienced? Is the supramental power or existence limited to Earth? Does it exist on other planets as well? And I want to conclude with this because it's so important. Because it was foreseen in the past. It's not something new in that sense. There is a huge new element, but there was something foreseen. First of all, the supramental power is everywhere because it's at the very basis of all creation. So it's equally everywhere. It is underlying mind, it is underlying life energy, it is underlying matter and all its processes. So wherever there are evolving beings, they have the potential to experience the supramental consciousness. If they so choose, they could bypass it totally and just open to the self, bypassing everything. That's a choice. And that's a choice of the spiritual trajectory. And there might be entire civilizations which might just do that. But yes, it is there because it's the underlying truth principle behind the whole cosmos. But the rishis, having touched the supramental consciousness, and it is described in the Vedic experience, and Sri Aurobindo confirms this and elaborates on it. He shows how they had very specific knowledge, they had entered the highest statuses of these domains of consciousness and worlds, and even lived in that consciousness while in the body. But there was a difference. They brought the supramental consciousness all the way into the mind and transformed the mind to various degrees, let's say. And that was the imprint left for humanity and defined the age that follows all the way to the present. But Sri Aurobindo observes they did not bring it all the way down to the physical. In the perhaps evolutionary stage that they were at, or Earth was at, perhaps it was premature. And it is this which is the work of Sri Aurobindo. He takes that work which was done, not only he gets to that, but he brings it all the way into the physical consciousness. Sets the space now for the next cycle, the next age, the next spiritual age. which is fundamentally greater because of this. Why? He points out elsewhere that because they did not bring the supramental all the way to the physical, a gap remained. The physical supports the supramental because it's embodied, but does not directly engage with the supramental, is not affected directly except by reflection. The analogy in the yoga tradition is like the candle. You have the candle and the wick and the flame that sits on the wick. Without the wick, the flame can't sit there. But the flame is fundamentally different and it consumes the wick. The wick cannot survive, the wick never becomes flame. This is your body supporting a mind which is supramentalized at best. But because this crack remains, this gap remains between the body and the supramental, the divine consciousness, let's say. Because this gap remains, eventually the crack becomes the cause for a split. And we find this in the Buddhist solution, where the solution to get free of suffering is then to get out, because as long as you're in the body, you cannot have it. As long as you're in the material world or in the domain of ignorance, you cannot be free of the suffering. Or ends with the Shankara realization that the divine reality and the world are fundamentally split and divided. This hairline crack, the gap that remains, becomes now a huge gulf, canyon separating two domains. The world becomes unreal in face of the divine, and the two are split. You see how important that limitation, fatal limitation, Sri Aurobindo uses this word fatal if I remember right. And that was the flaw, the limitation of the Vedic experience. Perhaps it was premature to take it further, but that caused all the rest that followed. Sri Aurobindo brings it all the way to heal this gulf and bridge the divine and the supramental consciousness with matter. And that sets the type for the future age. In the Isha Upanishad, which is drawn from the Veda, there is this famous verse which goes like this in Sanskrit. Vayur anilam amritam athedam bhasmantam shariram om krato smara kritam smara krato smara kritam smara. Translated loosely, Vayur anilam, the breath of things, Vayu, air, the life principle, is an immortal life. But of this body, ashes are the end. Bhasmantam shariram, bhasma, ashes, antam, ending in ashes, shariram, body. And then the second line goes, Om, krato, doer or the will, remember that which was done. Om, O will, remember that which was done. And it repeats, remember that which was done. O will, remember that which was done. Again, loosely translating, I will say, Om, O doer, remember that which was done. And then again it says, O doer, remember that which was done. And remember, the Upanishads are meant to be intuitive transmissions. So whatever they may transmit at that moment, in time they unveil much more, according to the need of the age, of the evolution. So when the entire Isha Upanishad has given you this divine life and the means of living a divine life on earth, why does it suddenly, in the last but one verse, declare the breath of things is an immortal life, but of this body ashes are the end? So you can read it as saying, okay, nothing to do with the body, forget it. Or you can read it, and this is how I see it. The body, ashes are the end. It's not compatible with the immortal life of the breath. This must be overcome. That's the suggestion, implicit, isn't it? And that's why it says Om. Om is the totality of Brahman always. It's the totality of the divine consciousness, including you. And then it says, O will, krato, you are the true doer, remember what was done. And then again it says, O will, remember, you the true doer, remember which was done. So the first time you're made to say, oh, remember what was done, and suddenly you say, ah, yes, and I go back. All this work which has been done across the life cycles, across the cycles of reincarnation, all this work which was done. And of the body, the ashes are the end. But life is immortal, and you face this fundamental incompatibility. And that's when again it says, oh, will remember that which was done, remember. And that's when you step back further still, that which was done, and the whole cosmic and the individual evolution. And you see in this grand scheme of things that while all this is unfolding, the body too has to eventually join with the immortality of life. And you're being reminded of this fundamental inconsistency in the totality of things. Wake up to this truth and realize this. So, depending on how you look at it, yes, the Vedic rishis brought it to a certain point, but they left you the indication of the work to be done, which was at that time perhaps premature, which Sri Aurobindo has now done and has set the type, the way the Vedic rishis set the type for the future spiritual evolution of humanity, and especially in India where it was retained in this concentrated way. Sri Aurobindo has set the type for the future humanity's evolution and its spiritual direction. And this is fundamentally one of unifying spirit with matter and the transformation of matter and the divinization of life itself. So this is the theme on which I am going to pause. There are questions, there were many important questions I had kept ready for today, and I think next time we will complete the questions relating to this topic so that we have a conclusion of the theme itself before we move to current affairs. While the theme is fresh, the questions also will be more obviously and better, more deeply understood. So, take a moment now to review this big picture that we have. And it's not a work that's happening now, it was foreseen long ago, it is seen in the very origins of the whole universe's births. That despite this fundamental incompatibility that matter seems to have in relation to the spirit, it too is an expression of the spirit and one day must reveal its spiritual truth and participate consciously in the spiritual incarnation of the soul as an active vehicle that is also worthy of its divinity, of expressing its divinity, without those limitations which Sri Aurobindo has pointed to. Remember what he says about this? It must be able to keep pace with the soul in its formation of self-expressive personality. Its long unfolding of a secret spiritual divinity and the slow transformation of the mental into the divine mental or spiritual existence. And if in this we get also help of science, occult or physical, to make the body younger or to live longer, healthier lives, take full advantage of that also. For this purpose, for the sadhana, to extend the work done in this lifetime. Having come to this point, it's so much worth it, even if you could add a few years of youth to your life so that you can do so much more, given the flexibility and plasticity it might offer. Review all these things, review what you can do. For each one of us, starting points might be different, priorities might be different, but this broad direction is set. And commit yourself to this work of deepening and growing in consciousness for the divine life on earth. Let's take a moment to hold and intensify our aspiration in this. With the work done by Sri Aurobindo and the Mother and infused into us by the thing already set in the type, in consciousness in them, and infused into us, this is now possible for everybody. Whether you've read or understood these things or not, the potential is there within you and is actively pushing you. Draw upon that, draw upon the Divine Mother's help, draw upon the imprint and the type set by Sri Aurobindo and infused in us, and let that work in you. In gratitude to this extraordinary gift that they have given to us, to all of earth humanity as well as cosmic humanity. Namaste.